Hello. So, in this talk, I am with a good friend and my main astrology teacher, Ari Moshe Wolfe. And today we are going to be talking about, he's going to be talking about Saturn, shame, and belonging, a compassionate view. And many people watching this already probably know Ari, but just to give a brief little bit about him, with clarity and compassion, Ari Moshe teaches astrology as a spiritual study that serves in our own soul evolution. Ari Moshe's teaching is rooted in the beautiful lineage of evolutionary astrology as taught by Jeffrey Wolfe Green, and continues to blossom with his own ongoing realization. And I am really looking forward to hearing more about Saturn. Ari's been doing tons of talks and conversations about Saturn because Saturn is squaring the nose of the moon much of this year. And anyway, there's so many layers to it for me, but where do you want to start, Ari?
Well, hello, everyone. Let me just start by appreciating that the reason why I chose to speak about Saturn in a symposium, it's about the masculine and feminine, is to really understand our relationship to anything, actually. We have to, in a sense, go through the gate of Saturn because Saturn corresponds to conditioning. And conditioning is multifaceted. Right? We have the conditioning of thought, right? You think something, you maintain certain habits of thinking, conditioning of the body, posture. If you want to condition a good posture, you have to practice it. All conditioning implies time. We have the conditioning of how a nation or a country operates. It's grown, it's developed over time to be that way. And then we have the conditioning of patriarchy. And when I'm saying patriarchy, I'm just being very specific. It's a particular way of looking at reality that has been sort of the bottom line, a basic perspective for pretty much the entire world for a long time, hundreds and even into thousands of years. Every single era has its own way of looking, its own way of thinking. And it doesn't matter what area of life you're looking at, sexuality, relationship, gender, how to live as a human being, ideas of survival. In fact, you can take every astrological archetype and you're going to see it manifesting according to the particular social, global, cultural climate at the time. This is a very, very important thing to understand because in a sense, we're unraveling so much of our own conditioning, so many beliefs and ideas that we've inherited that we just assume is what is. You don't realize the paradigm you're in while you're in it. You only can see it when you're out of it and recognize, oh, that was just a paradigm. And there's an extent to which we can say patriarchy, which has been around for a long time, it manifests as such an assumed way of being. And so to give an example of this, because when anyone speaks about patriarchy, it can sound like a sort of, can often sound like a very loose, ambiguous term that's just used to describe why things aren't great. But it's very specific. Take the idea of money, right? Money is a thing that we make, we earn. It allows us to buy the things that we need so that we can live here. It's so what we do, but that's all that it is. It's just another paradigm. And if we actually take a greater step back, for example, if we look at nature, the idea of money, it's such a foreign and unnatural concept. And we can apply this to everything. How we organize family and relationship or marriage. These are constructs that have manifested culturally in different parts of the world, different eras in different ways, in completely different ways at different times of history. So there's a certain way of being, and that I would generally describe as to be here as a human means we have to adopt and conform to certain assumed constructs of right and wrong. And in a way, we kind of have to. The idea is not to be defined by it, but we, if I want to function in this world, in the country that I'm living in, I will have to pay taxes. If I want to function and make money to support my family, I'll have to do something to do that. If I really wanted to change the paradigm, I have to apply a lot of thought and self-reflection to condition something else. And I'd have to also appreciate, if I want to condition a different reality, it's going to set me apart from the mainstream. And the mainstream is like literally pretty much everyone and everything, all of my family, everyone I know. To be using computers and technologies, it implies a certain relationship to life where we accept you take resources from the earth to commodify them for our purposes. It just is true. It's what we do. And we have ideas of environmentalism and taking care of the earth and taking care of each other. But the way we think of it is actually all within the paradigm of the world we're living in. Very few people are saying, stop buying phones or computers because it's mining resources. That's almost like too inaccessible. You wouldn't be able to participate socially in the world. So this is just an acceptance. Everyone alive today, in virtue of incarnating at this time, this day and age, it means we're all conditioned by patriarchy, by the particular cultural climate within which we're a part of, that's been conditioning and growing to be what it is over a long, long time. It means we've also inherited from our family, from our society. And as a soul, karmically, it's relevant. We've inherited particular patterns of thinking. And on the evolutionary journey, structural change, when we look at change on a Saturn level, it takes a long time because the Saturn corresponds to the thermostat, right? It's like, what's the gravity? You go somewhere, you go to a country, there are rules, there are norms, there are social norms. For any of those norms or rules to change, it has to make its way to the bottom, right? It has to make its way to the source of the foundation, like the common denominator. For example, let's see if one more example as we kind of build to today's topic, but this is all very relevant. Women's suffrage, women's rights, women voting. So you have one of many possible examples. Here in the United States, there was a time where that was a very fringe idea. So thus we can say it fell within the Uranian realm, right? There are groups of people that saw a more liberated, awake way of living. And so the Uranus-Saturn interface is always expressing that. There's a more awake, intelligent, which means evolved way of being that reflects what's natural, which is an inclusive way of being, free of imposed conditions, or more free, less imposed conditions, relative to the imposed conditions that the majority of people alive just accept as what is. So to get something new, even if for many people it's like the most obvious thing in the world, to get anything new into the status quo takes time because conditioned minds need to open up. There needs to be a repetitive interface with certain ideas and experiences adequately enough for a change to actually happen. This is what it's like on our own journey as well. For any real substantial structural change on the level of thought to truly take hold, we need to expose ourselves to it and practice it continually, repetitively. And it's an important thing to understand. The Uranian experiences can be illuminating, like in a moment, just profound insights. And there can be a profound sense of departing or stepping away from our conditioned way of being. But it's very common when we have Uranian insights, be it applying it on a social level, applying it in our relationships, applying it in our own personal life, how we're living, our own habits. It doesn't usually work, right? A purely Uranian experience can often manifest as like, you have a Kundalini experience, you don't have to eat or sleep for 3 days, and you're just like seeing everything clearly. Generally, that's followed by a period of integration. And that's how we can really appreciate and respect the Saturn dimension. Saturn at the core, and this is the most important thing to understand about the Saturn archetype that I feel is seldomly appreciated or recognized. Saturn at the core corresponds to mastery of time and space. What that means is learning how to be in relationship to all things conditions, all conditioning, all things that are form, all things that are of time, all things that, in a sense, are malleable and shapeable and open to be conditioned. It's forming a relationship to all things such that they are conditioned in ways that are relevant and useful and supportive to our awakening, to our remembering. Thus, the quote from A Course in Miracles, which I frequently quote, which I really bow to, the purpose of time is to learn how to use time purposefully. Right? We have to remember what's important. Why are we here? And this is an important understanding because we tend to be defined by time. As I've mentioned, it is necessary along the evolutionary journey to know how to incorporate and to be involved, to participate with the structures of society. Because if I want to participate in life, I'll need to learn how to do certain things that come with the current life and world that I'm living in, as a citizen, as a human being, whatever, but to not be identified with it. And most of us, to an extent that we're not aware of, are identified by conditions of form, time, and space. That's where we go into, well, I am a man. I am this body. This is my spouse. This is my money and my home and the life that I'm defining as valuable, that defines my own valuable, that defines my own value, right? Different than recognizing, yes, I'm manifesting in a male form and there's a certain biology that I'm present to, a certain sexual orientation, certain gender orientation that I'm noticing is true for me. But already right there, we can easily stray from cultural projections of, well, you look like you're in a male body and thus that means this, right? To recognize, okay, well, here's a certain physiology, but how, on a certain level, we can say, how do I identify myself? And that's not necessarily a spiritual awareness. It can be simply, how do I identify as a human? That's great. And at the core, though, how do we identify as a being? Who are we? What are we? Right? So we're all learning to navigate the realm of time and space and form in our own ways, in ways that are relevant and useful. So we're not getting sucked into what the world says we should be, or to the inherited beliefs that we've learned around, well, this is how I'm supposed to behave. This is how you are supposed to behave. This is the right way to do things. We have to define all things for ourselves and use all things consciously. So if I'm making money, it's not just because I have to support a family. Why am I supporting a family? Everything comes back down to each individual soul's evolutionary program. And if I am here to support a family, which means my own life, my own soul journey is interwoven with family, it means I'm going to become incredibly introspective and reflective upon what do I need to do to support my family. And that brings me into awareness of society, life, earning money. If we're just going along with the flow, and we just say, well, yeah, you gotta make money. In fact, you gotta have a family. I come from a culture. I mentioned this recently in the talk I gave with Astrology Hub, but the Sephardic Jewish community that I grew up near, there's a sort of assumption, if you're a man, you got to earn, like a lot of money before you marry. And these things are changing, but there's a sort of cultural paradigm that just says this is, but not many people tend to ask, but why am I doing that, right? Everything has to be deeply relevant. And so that's where there's a deep level of introspection and self-reflection. We see this happening. So as Uranian dynamics are becoming more integrated, it gets more into the status quo. I spoke about gender identity, sexual identity, which I imagine is going to probably come up a lot in the symposium, or maybe not. But that at first was a very Uranian thing. And it was actually predominantly a threatening or unsafe thing for any soul to not identify with their assigned gender at birth. Now it's becoming more Zoom will ask you, what are your pronouns? Right? There is much more acceptance integrated and structured within the status quo. Right? So that's a great example of where our relationship to form, right, to the rules, to the structures, even to legislation, where it's beginning to reflect a more evolved and inclusive consciousness, right? We're not letting go of form or definition. We're creating forms, and we're defining our relationship to form in ways that accommodate to more inclusivity. That's what we have to understand about time. As we evolve, we're going to think about survival. We're going to think about relationship. We're going to think about what it means to be a human being in new ways. And that's going to always manifest fundamentally. Deepest level of integration is going to manifest on the level of form and time and space. It's going to say, thus, here are the structures that we've created that allows and holds space for us to be what we've realized that we are. What we think we are will always reflect in the structures that we've given ourselves to and have conditioned. So that's why working with Saturn, speaking about Saturn here is important, because to understand our relationship to sexuality, to relationship to the energetics of the masculine and feminine, we need to go through the gate of our conditioning and constructs and assumptions that are just so in us. Now, we've planted the foundation. Okay, we get the idea of Saturn, it's conditioning, and there needs to be a lot of introspection and self-awareness. What I want to do and focus on in this conversation is where shame has a big part to do with this. And the topic of this talk is, correct me if I got this wrong, shame and belonging, a compassionate view. Mm-hmm. So I'll just say one more thing and then I'll hand it over to you to play. But shame and belonging, whenever we're defined by the form, this is who I have to be. I have to act this way. I have to be this way, or I can't have these needs. I can't want these things. Right? Or, oh, well, society's going to judge me for this, or my parents are going to judge me, my spouse is going to judge me for this. All of these things, when we find ourselves bound by conditioning and we think it's who we are, we're defined by it, we become one, incredibly sensitive to external opinion. Incredibly sensitive because it defines us, and we have to understand this. And for everyone listening, I really invite reflection on this, even to think of your own Saturn. Maybe we can think more easily of people that we know. Where there is a deep identification with what society or family has conditioned us to believe and think about ourselves, we're going to be incredibly sensitive to that. The identity that I think I am is going to be hurt. Now, identity is fragile. Infinite soul consciousness, when it says, I am this, and it believes that, we're channeling a lot of power into an idea. And unless there's a little bit of space and willingness to question that idea, its survival depends on the validation of that idea. So if, for example, crying in public, let's give one random, if a man crying in public is an invalidation of their masculinity, this is a very super traditional Marlboro Man example, maybe not super duper relevant, at least in the Western culture in this day and age, but let's just say
in California, Sonoma County.
Right, maybe not so much that, but we know it exists, and maybe our grandparents can identify more with this, but any example, if there is hurt, if there's, or just let's make it more real. You're in a relationship, you're a man, you have strong feelings, you really want to be held, but you feel obligated, you feel responsible to be strong, to hold it down, to care for everyone else and be responsible, but not to be vulnerable. That's a very easy one. That's a very common one. And then there's going to be a point where if the vulnerability or the little boy inside that needs care comes out, there can be an immense amount of embarrassment and shame. Now, it can take one person making a comment, "Why are you so sensitive?" That can trigger an immense amount of shame. Now, this can go in many directions. This could also go in the direction of anger, right? There's a whole identity with conditioning will yield profound sensitivity to external judgments. And if you kind of make a flow chart and draw 2 arrows, we're going to find various emotional states that stem from that. Shame and anger are sort of siblings. They're going to come out in different ways, and they're going to be directed in different directions at different times, but they're very related.
Maybe
So, what's that?
Fear would
Yeah,
fear
absolutely.
add that one in there.
Absolutely. Because fear is fear, you can say, is at the core of it. I'm being outed. They're going to find out how bad I am, how wrong I am. As a child, making this up, as a child, my mother or father scolded me for crying, that I watched a scary movie and I was scared, and they yelled at me for being scared. And I learned that it's not okay to be vulnerable, So we can find so many examples of this in our own life. And so, okay, this talk is shame and belonging, because where there's shame, where there's a sense of this is not okay, which we'll unpack from a Saturn perspective, where that's there is also where we don't know belonging. And we don't often think of belonging when we think of Saturn. And I often use belonging in the context of other archetypes. Uranus, which corresponds to the inherent belonging of all things. It's like all aspects of God's mind, all archetypes belong. But belonging with Saturn is a much more intimate level of belonging. And I often speak of it with Moon. Of course, you need to feel belonging. You need to feel loved as you are, in a sense of your emotions are okay. And in fact, Saturn and Moon are polarities. It's very, very important to understand the relationship between Saturn and the Moon, because in a sense, when we look at doing the Saturn healing work, we're also going to be looking at emotional repression. The Moon, think of a baby, it just needs to have emotions. It doesn't regulate itself yet. Saturn, we learn how to regulate. We learn how to be in relationship to emotional responses, hopefully not repress, but also understand how to meet it, put it aside, and be in the moment as necessary, and kind of meet energetics within, meaning we're not abnegating self-intimacy, but we're also being mature and responsible and mindful that we're not the only one. There's a sort of narcissism in babies and children. They don't have the capacity to recognize they're not the only one. So there needs to be a deep level of acceptance as they mature to just be where they are and have the emotions they're having. A lot of the Saturn dynamics are imprints from early life, where we never learned that. And so now we have the tenderness, the emotional experience of being a human, and we bring that into our relationships. We bring all of our assumptions and our ideas and our beliefs of how it's supposed to be, how you're supposed to be, how I'm supposed to be. And so we're repressing core fundamental emotional facets of our being. Thus, understanding how belonging relates to Saturn is so essential, because belonging is the antidote to shame. So let me stop there. We'll go more into it and create some space.
Yeah, I have many questions, but the main thing I'm thinking about is recently you've mentioned often a desire for us all to think of Saturn in a new way, or think of Saturn in a way that's maybe different from what we have been thinking of Saturn as. So I'm thinking about the deconditioning of our own conditioning around Saturn's conditioning. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So for example, related to what you're saying, you keep saying, people talk about Saturn as the taskmaster. Please stop saying that.
Yeah.
Right. And it's making me think about the polarity of Cancer to Capricorn and the moon to Saturn. And it's making me wonder about, what are your thoughts on, like, let's say if we took Saturn and we took the moon, and we were able to decondition our conditioning around what we think those are in a pure sense. Okay, you talk about also Saturn. We think of Saturn as this harsh energy, but in reality, it's actually very gentle and yin, right?
Mhm.
And so that's so much in line with what our conditioning is around the moon and Cancer energies. And so I'm just trying to come to this understanding of, if we were able to take ourselves out of time and space and out of this particular moment on the planet Earth and the conditioning that we have around what is our relationship to authority, what is our relationship to time and space, what would be the fundamental essence of the Saturn and the moon energies, and what would their balancing with each other be
The
like?
words that come to me is, this moment is okay. Because
Hmm.
we get tight and
Hmm.
tense, and I would say even defensive,
Hmm.
right? We become, there's a sort of vigilance that develops in our shame, in our anger, in our judgments, in our deep concern with who we're supposed to be and how we protect that.
Hmm.
Um, all of those stances, they imply a perception that sees something wrong.
Yeah.
And that's the very opposite of what we need in order to heal and feel a sense of belonging, which fundamentally says this moment's okay because you're okay. Right? So where there's judgment, where there's anger,
Hmm.
where there's a deep shame or even a righteousness to shame others, shame on you, right? We have the shame on you dynamic is totally a Saturn, Saturn thing. That's all these different expressions can be directed. The deep sensitivity to other people's judgments and getting angry at them for their judgments. Um, judge, being angry at people for judging oneself. Being so concerned with, oh, okay, where we're going to your in-laws. Just giving another example, I got to make sure I wear this dress because, all these different things, or how, to what extent are we trying to, forge our body, make ourselves look a certain way that reflects how our parents said something to us when we were a child, or an important relationship that impacted us when we were teenagers. All of these things, if we just look at the energetics and we just forget the time thing for a moment, it's sort of just like it's like a stance of, I gotta make sure everything's okay. Gotta make sure. I remember once had this meal, and I was with several people, and there's a woman and her young child, and I don't remember what the child was doing, but I remember it was a thing a child does. Like, she wasn't making a mess. I think she was making faces or something like that. And the mother was livid. Just stop doing that. There's company around. And I was like, wow, I really didn't, I saw nothing wrong with that. There was nothing, we weren't like having a meeting with the president of the United States or whatever. And it was a very clear, we can see that very easily in others, often not so much in ourselves, that there's something there, right? For that individual, there's some sort of deep embarrassment and shame that she learned. But if you just slow down and relax, look around, everything's okay.
It,
Everything's okay.
so it makes me think of the sympathetic nervous system versus the
Mm-hmm.
parasympathetic nervous system. And I think of, stereotypically, like moon energy would, to me, evoke like the parasympathetic nervous system. But what it's making me think of is, actually maybe in the healthy deconditioned version of a Saturn energy, there's actually a support of us relaxing into the parasympathetic nervous system as well. Does that fit?
Well, the idea is the conditioning is there, and so that relaxation may not be easy. It
Mm.
needs to be practiced.
Mm.
That's the point here. This is where we do the deeper work. If we're unraveling masculine, feminine expressions and archetypes, we have to appreciate there's a particular conditioning and patterning and vigilance and defensiveness
Mm.
and role playing that is so embedded that to actually relax, we need to become aware of the stance that we're holding first. And we have to realize we have a choice, really, to live our life enslaved to the acceptance of the judge, needing other people to accept us according to the identity we thought we've needed to be. So that might be, I don't want to show this part of myself, or I need to hold this part of or I need to hold this in this way. And this is where so many relationships, we can say, as we look at, couples that are, around for a long time, there comes a point where we've sold ourselves, where we've given our soul away for, you play this role, I play this role, it yields depression and rage. And this is almost common because society is familiar with that. Of course, society that has accepted certain repressed norms will also become familiar with depression and rage. And so we have medications to deal with it, which I'm not judging as a whole, but as a society, there's a way that we've been in relationship to these emotions that doesn't really address why is that there in the first place? What conditions created that? So to actually soften and come into a relaxed state takes work. And when we look at belonging, there's a powerful, almost like profound teaching and realization, which is, if this is okay, then this is okay. I don't know what to do with this, and that must also be okay. If we really want to take it deeply, this brings us to a very spiritual understanding. It takes us into a relationship to something beyond our own control, something beyond our own making. We don't have an answer to our conditioning other than we recognize it. We don't know how to not be it other than to realize we're not it, but we can be in the energetic field of it. So strong, so present in it. That's where there's humility. Saturn being discipline. To have a loving relationship to discipline is really this caring, devoted commitment to oneself and to realization. It's a committed relationship to not live in unconsciousness, to not live in slavery, because that's what Saturn essentially is when we're not bringing awareness into our patterns.
So again, that brings up another idea about Saturn that I wonder if there's a healthier way to think of it, is that often, I speak for myself, have thought of Saturn as something we're trying to undo, right? So like Uranus comes along and frees us from the Saturn conditioning. But like you said earlier, we need all of these energies. We would not want to live in a purely Uranian life. That wouldn't work. So when, for example, okay, I was wondering this morning in my prayers, actually. When I think of Saturn, I often think of slowing down. And when I think of Uranus, I think of speed, like fast change, right? That's a stereotype. But one thing that I wonder about is, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, would you say that slowness and speed are inherent to the Saturn and Uranus archetype, or is it because, partly maybe because in our society, speed is our tendency, that Saturn needs to slow us down? In other words, is Saturn inherently slower than Uranus, or is Saturn just helping us use time and space in the way that's the most helpful, and often, given our current circumstances, slowing down is what is more helpful? But in other circumstances, maybe Saturn, like if there was a Saturn transit, would you say sometimes it would even speed things up if that was right for the time and space needed?
What I would say to that is Saturn itself corresponds to speed. Because speed is related to time. Speed is relative. It can be slowed down, it can be quickened.
Yeah.
Saturn is very malleable because the forms, this is what we have to understand. It's like we need time, we need form. We don't. We actually, like, we don't inherently need it.
Mm.
We need it for our learning. That's why we're here. It
Right.
has no purpose, limitations, body, gravity. It's not just some sort of arbitrary feature that comes with existence. It's a manifestation coming from emptiness, coming from infinity. And it's almost like a stage that we're on, and we drop it in the ways and dimensions that we do. I often speak about, when you finish 12th grade in high school, you're done. You don't repeat it unless you failed and you need to repeat it. And there are people that graduate high school early.
Mm.
Time and the speed in which things take is very relative.
Mhm.
So it really is a matter of how we are in relationship to our conditioning and, quote unquote, the curriculum. And for some souls, there's no judgment on this other than a recognition of what is. For some souls, there are certain curriculums that are particularly heavy, where this life is concentrated, and it's going to take a little more time because we're unraveling a lot of conditioning. That just is what it is. Uranus itself isn't fast because Uranus doesn't have anything to do with speed. Uranus isn't conditioned by time and space. And so Uranus is what is. Thus, when there's a Uranus transit, there can be a sense of quickening because our consciousness, which is not defined by form, is, in a sense, departing or turning from its identifications with form and opening to reality as it is. That's why there can be a sense of quickening insight and, awakenings, and like everything's a synchronicity, but it's not happening faster. It's not an inherently quick thing. It's just relative to our own conditioning. And to answer that last question, yes, Saturn transits will generally be slow, will generally speak to a deepening of self-awareness, self-reflection, because again, we're looking within, we're building habits and patterns. But then there comes a point in a Saturn process where things can feel like they're quickening because they're running smoothly. And that's where we understand. Take an example of starting a business, right? You start a business, it's slow in the beginning. You take out a loan, you build the first foundations, you get the whatever. There comes a point where suddenly all these things are happening and you have 20 people working for you and all this capital is coming in. That's happening in time and in space, but you've created the foundations for that. Our own spiritual realizations can be happening in that, and when that happens in a Saturn way, there's no fraying. We're not overly excited and frayed because the foundation has been created for it. It has to become stable, integrated growth.
Yeah. And this might be getting a little out there, but you often talk about Uranus as the sort of the vision of the divine. I don't know if those are your exact words, but sort of how the divine would, what wording would you put to that? Do you know what I'm trying to say?
The intelligence of creator.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Intelligence.
Yeah. So I often have this experience that I think a lot of people do, where when I go into a meditative state, right, I will often be shown sort of an energetic map of time in a sense. So like I'll get shown, oh, there's an energetic arc of whatever it is, like I need to reach out to so and so, but it's not quite time yet, and I can see like I can see a line of light that'll go from here to, like, let's say next Tuesday, and then I'll get this very clear feeling like connect with them next Tuesday, right? So to me, it's like that what I'm seeing, I feel like, is a Uranian vision, but then it's like interplaying with Saturn energy.
Well, it's so fun and interesting because if we recognize time is as impersonal and removed from our being as I am picking up this lid, the higher mind or divine intelligence, which is just the only thing that is, can reference time in any kind of creative way, right? It can represent it in all kinds of ways. That's why we can have dreams and symbols. I mean, I've had dreams that I've seen events happening years before they've happened.
Yeah.
and it can throw a loop to the Saturn mind, the conditioned mind, really, that doesn't understand. To quote A Course in Miracles, the script is written.
Well, and it
You
makes
know?
me think of like a flower, right? Like
Yeah.
if we could see the through the intelligence of the divine, we would somehow know. Like let's say we never saw a flower bloom, but we're somehow tapped into the intelligence of the divine. We would somehow inherently maybe know, oh, this flower needs to first, have it be a seed, then sprout, then la 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 la, and eventually it's going to bloom into these with these petals.
Yep.
And so it's like when you come back to the topic of shame and Saturn, it's like, would we ever shame that flower for not blooming yet?
Right.
That
Exactly.
doesn't make sense, right?
Exactly.
um
I often have that sense where I can energetically feel. Right, we're all going to be interpreting in kind of like whatever forms we see, even if it's energetic forms and light, or it's all going to be very specific to our own conditioning. Right? There's no form that we can actually hold on to. Right? That's why people can have illuminations and awakenings and experience God in all different kinds of forms and ways. So something that I often experience is it's an imperceptible scent, and I can't really describe it very easily, where I can feel. It's not even feeling, even, right? It's a sense, almost it's maybe just a seeing, um, of what's beyond all of this,
mm,
and the dramas and the traumas and the confusing places of my own life, the places that are we're working things out, our human journey, right? Where I can sense what is underneath all the noise, and what it shows me is there's a natural destiny that just is. That destiny isn't a time-oriented thing. It's kind of like when we're not defined by arbitrary conditioning, thus we are relaxed and we can live as we are, and we're using form in ways that are useful, but we're not suppressed by them. There's a natural unfolding that is just like the flower. It becomes exactly what it's destined to be. It's already designed as that. And
yeah.
thus there isn't really much of a choice in it. The it's just the natural unfolding of what is. And the more I sense that, the more space I feel between the very places where conditioning is very strong. And this is what I want to, really give some more attention to. There is a feeling of restfulness and peace, and everything's where it needs to be, and everything belongs when we're not in struggle with the things of form and time and space and roles and identities and constructs. When our life isn't defined by that struggle, we can start to feel inside of ourselves a great sense of infinity and space, and we can see one another in that way as well. We can see one another in that way that honors and reflects an essential unity. Like Ram Dass, we're just divine in drag. And we don't really feel so strongly about the bodies and the forms. And even the idea of, you know, any way in which we've been conditioned to think of, well, this is what masculine means, this is what feminine means, because really at the core it's all inside,
Mhm.
right? So our experience of these archetypes, our awakening to them is an awakening to what is, and it's free of all of the cultural historical conditioning and ideas and imprints around them. And there's an immense freedom. This is where I feel like the journey of awakening, if we look at the masculine and feminine, it is this purely internal dance. And when we're freed from identifying with the forms and the roles, we see that we're in relationship with one another in life, but we're really just, I mean, in the truest sense, walking each other home, because we're dancing with each other, seemingly bodies dancing with each other, words, forms, talks, agreements, things happening in time, but it's all inside, 100% inside. It's 100% our dance with these these primal forces aren't even separate, and that's the paradox of all of this. There is not a separation. It's really the stance with the infinite truth of what we are now and always, and the longing to reunite with that. Like this seeming sense of separation and the truth of unity, and the poetry of this unity. That's where the soul journey is pure desire. The longing, the pure desire to only be what we are isn't a static state of realization. Our attention is drawn to concentrate on reuniting with what already is. And it's like two lovers that can't ever meet because they already are one. So it's like and that's the poetry in all relationships. That's what's really going on underneath all these ways in which we play out these polarities. If we can understand that the manifestations of these polarities, and even where certain souls will identify more with the masculine or feminine expressions, it's really, really just like the outer shell of a really rich inner dance. And it's all happening inside.
Yeah.
This is something that we access as we free ourselves from the identifications with the forms and how things look and the ways that we behave. We recognize, and there's an immense sense of compassion in that, because we can see we're all doing the same thing. And when we remove ourselves from the triggers and the judgments and the fears and the suppressions and repressions that come oftentimes on the journey, we can recognize that there is a profound sense of belonging. Your journey and my journey are a perfect mirror to each other, but in such a radical, we often use the idea of mirroring, but I don't feel we often feel the devotion of that, like the bhakti in that statement, in that understanding. Like mirroring is an absolute and radical truth, not in like, yeah, you're just reflecting my, it's not like that. Everything that arises is pointing to where the journey actually is right now, and it's within. And that within isn't within me, not outside. It's just within. It's not even within me, it's within. There's no separation. There's not within you, within me. It's just within. We really find that to be so when we're in the path, when we're actually with the content in the process. And there's no way to be there if we're holding that, okay, all that sounds really great, but it's like all this attention gets back into, yeah, but I can't hold hands in public. It's like we have to be able to just create a big wedge between these conditioned unnatural constructs and to see the crevices of them. And that's where a part of the journey with Saturn in really working with shame. I'm bad, you're bad, this is wrong, this can't be. I'm either going to retreat or go within or get angry and harsh. Like these are the ways that we deal with the immense terror and fear when identity is threatened. To actually realize on the other end of that is this poetic, beautiful journey, which to me is the essence of my understanding of Tantra in the truest sense. Has nothing to do with bodies, has nothing to do with proximities of time and space. And again, even like spiritual practices, we can get overly conditioned and confused by an idea of, well, two bodies are doing something together. No. The true journey, the divine poetry is that direct seeing that there's just a journey inside, and it's this.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is a great way to end up closing. When I prayed on what name the symposium wanted, what I got was becoming the one. And when I saw that in my praying, I saw it as the light, going straight back up into source in this way. But when you're talking, what I'm feeling is, sure, yes, but it's actually also the dance re-becoming the one, that we're doing inside ourselves with each other as the one, all as one, all at the same time. Yeah.
There's just really come back to the idea of compassion when we appreciate and understand that so much of our conditioning is defined by the culture, the family, the society, and hundreds of years of learning, there becomes such a great space to not know. And I observe and
Mm.
experience myself. Not knowing is a true state of sanity. Not knowing in terms of not knowing what things will look like, not knowing what things will be. My observations, truly, people in an awake state, really awake, also don't know. You know, like there's almost like a pie chart correlation. Awaken to true nature, increase that, very little beliefs about the next moment.
Mm.
And at the same time, there's also in that space that Uranian intelligence can also come through, where you just see the future as clearly as you see the past, as a reflection of just what is. Like you see the flower, and it
Mm.
doesn't really become a belief, and there's no like this has to become a flower. It's just you see it and you're like, oh yeah, in 20 years. And one can access such a level of intelligence if accessed, right? But the the freedom of really not having such a strong hold on what bodies do in form, in time, in space is such a sane and healthy way to be.
Mm.
Because then it says what we're doing with bodies, what we're doing with time and space and form and money and jobs and roles and work and responsibilities in the world, it really comes from an informed, spirit informed, thoughtful, conscious way of being in life with agency as a soul. And it doesn't take up more space. So that's a very important thing. And that's why, coming back to what you said around how I feel strongly about the whole Saturn's a taskmaster. It's a harsh and unuseful way of thinking about it, unless we redefine taskmaster as the master of task,
Mm.
right? Being a taskmaster is one who has mastered tasks. It's a beautiful, if you think of a spiritual mastery, but we
Mm.
need to take the harshness
Right.
from that to really understand how to be in right relationship to the Saturn from a higher understanding of spirituality, from a deeper understanding of who we are and what this life's about.
Yeah, I think if I were to take away one thing out of all the Saturn talks you've been giving and everything lately, is I just keep coming back to the gentleness, like
Hmm.
to allow Saturn to be a gentle presence. Um,
Yeah.
and
I had a really interesting dream. Um, I know I said I have to go at this point, but we can give a few more minutes. I had a really interesting dream recently where I saw myself losing a lot of possessions in several dreams. And I woke up from that with this like very tangible feeling of being disturbed, almost as if, I have Saturn and Scorpio in the second house. So karmically, there's a very strong imprint of actually having lost possessions and wealth and things like that in past lives and whatnot. Um, just as much as I've also lived in ways where I'm learned how to survive and not need a lot of things. And there's a lot of spiritual learning in my Saturn signature. But just to acknowledge, this is a Saturn piece for me. I woke up with a feeling of being disturbed, as if like I didn't feel like I had a strong hold. A metaphor would be jumping out of an airplane with a wallet in your hand. It's not stable enough. It feels like there's too much air pressure, and you can easily like drop the wallet, and the air will blow it away. There's like a feeling of instability, right? And I was just really present to that. And I had a dream. One of those dreams, I had one of my spiritual teachers, who actually David Hoffmeister, who teaches A Course in Miracles. He said something to me like, "Where do you believe you can lose?" Something like that. And I don't remember the exact wording, but what I got from that is dreams or fears or anticipations of terror and loss in form and time and space at the core point back to some kind of conditioning, right? If we really look at it, this is like a very profound thing to look at, even if it happens, right? There's a deep reflection, nothing that happens in form and time and space is arbitrary. In fact, if everything is a lesson, what's a lesson? Well, lessons aren't like, you have to learn this lesson. No, the only lesson that could ever happen is the lesson of self-remembering. The only lesson God can ever teach is the only thing it is. Right? Only love can be taught because it's all that is, and thus it's not even taught. It's just all things point back to our relationship to that, which is an unthreatened state of being. So if we think of it in that way, everything in time and space and form and all challenges, all fear, really just being a lesson in our remembering, then we can appreciate bad things happening or loss has no purpose. There's no meaning in it. And thus, if it's happening or if we sense it, there's a teaching here now in it. And I'm just sharing that because I'm like, oh, I get that. It takes me into looking at some things. But it's a very, very helpful way of looking at Saturn as well, because we get very definitive about form. As if, I mean, it's like, yeah, there's spirituality, but like God doesn't pay the bills. There are all these ways in which we separate love and time and space. And I really want to emphasize in our learning, in our working with Saturn, in our working with being a human, that we understand all challenges, all problems are really the same thing. All of them. They're all pointing to the same correction, which is always the same thing. Right? Which is it's hard to give the words to it. But there's only one mistake, which is belief in separation, belief in what we are that is not true, identifying with constructs of form and time and space, believing we are something that is vulnerable to loss and gain. And there's only one correction, one remembering, which is what we are, which is an inherent state of wholeness and peace and infinity and forgiveness. And that our very nature is whole, and that we're guided and loved like a child with very secure parents that can just trust. And their parents will never, ever want something bad to happen to their children. Where we think, well, God's going to hurt us or judge us or teach us some harsh lesson. It's like a child thinking, oh, my parents are going to punish me. It's a mistake in thinking. So it's a very powerful practice to work with. It's a big part of the training in A Course in Miracles, where we learn to recognize that every problem is the same and everything has the same solution. Thus, we're not looking at form and time and space and sequestering and dividing and categorizing different problems. It's a really beautiful practice that I'm learning and I wanted to share as well.
Yeah, it makes me think of, like, if I'm thinking of, okay, the layers from the archetype, the stereotypes of the archetype of Saturn back to source. This is what comes to me. It's like, got Saturn, which we associate with patriarchy, which is, I know is not, it's not a one-to-one correlation, but that's often what people think of. You go underneath that patriarchy to conditioning or whatever, and you go underneath the conditioning to taskmaster, some version of that. You go underneath that to, no, hang on, we don't need to think of it in such a harsh way. We can think of it as a gentle yin version of interacting with time and space. And then somehow we soften from that. This is my experience of it, at least. We soften from that back into the one. Are you following that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. One way that lands for me is looking at where there's fear and harshness and tension or judgment or shame. Yeah. And thus simultaneously how real it feels, because all of those emotions point to a very concrete, by the way, concrete is a Saturn word. Concrete feels very concrete, but it's not anyway. A very concrete sense of realness with the people and the places and the bodies and the words and the things that cause and create stress and fear, and the problems that we perceive within them and the ways that we go towards solutions. But it's all happening within that paradigm of, I got to maintain this sense of normalcy because I'm so defined by these things. So it's just in that we just recognize that harshness, that tension that we're carrying, and we realize, okay, this means I'm mistaken. This means I have some sort of confusion. And I don't know yet what the teaching is, what the answer is,
Yeah.
but I can recognize by just observing where I am right now that there is an unraveling that wants to happen here. And thus, that's sort of the entry point into an openness to a softening.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the funny thing is, in learning how to use time and space usefully for the functioning, for the undoing of time and space, right?
Yeah.
We learn to create practices and discipline, be it therapy, spiritual practices, body practices, learning certain technique. We work with form to help unravel. Ramana Maharshi's quote around this, or paraphrasing, is, inquiry is like using a piece of wood to get out a splinter. Right? We learn to be like, okay, here's some, how do I, because the forgiveness of time, it's so profound. It's here for our using. That's why we can, like, let's create these new rules, right? Let's try this thing. And that new construct will then be a new form that we can grab onto that will help us look at things differently and kind of get underneath the tension and the harshness. And then we drop that. So yeah, there's all these beautiful ways that we're learning to be forgiving and gentle and caring in our life. And there are so many teachers and modalities and practices, and there are possibilities for living that one may not know because they haven't been open to it, because they've been living in this particular box. The moment there's the openness to recognize, ooh, this is a box, this must mean I've gotten myself in that at some point and it's not so useful, I'm open to softening. A whole world of possibilities. And a whole world of possibilities is a very loving thing for Saturn. That can otherwise feel so concrete. And by the way, the reason why I love pointing out how funny it is that we call, Saturn concrete, is because we think concrete is concrete. But if there's an earthquake, it's like something more powerful, and that's where Uranus comes. Like, all this concrete can just break up. It doesn't matter how long it's taken to harden, how much effort we've put into mixing the concrete. It can take a moment for all of that to just break up. And that's how Saturn is not the strongest thing.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Martha. Thanks for this opportunity.
Yeah. And of course, normally I would close by listing all the places people can find you. They will all be listed with your stuff, but arimoshe.com. Yeah.
Yes.
And you do amazing music and teachings and sessions and anything else you want to say around that.
Yeah. Check it out. I have many classes. For those that have signed up to this, you can actually get the Saturn, the Saturn class series at half off. So there are many wonderful classes and also free resources on my site and courses that I'm teaching every year. So yeah, definitely check it out if you feel a resonance and an interest.
Absolutely. And I can say, Ari, again, is my main astrology teacher. So the reason I feel called to work with him personally is because this exact exchange we just had is exactly it. But it's, for me, on this incredibly deep soul level, is I opened to astrology in my own way, but Ari's words, whether I'm listening to a video or talking to him directly or whatever it is, literally it's like your soul comes straight into my soul, and then the unraveling that I need in that moment just happens, whatever that happens to be. And that's been consistent for years now. So it's like such a gift. And I know I'm not the only one who feels that way. Thank you, Ari.